The questions that we're going to ask this evening are important ones as we consider what it means to be human. This is very important in my own field of bioethics and social ethics and also in theological ethics. And I think it's critical for everyone who is involved in healthcare in different ways, both as clinicians and researchers, and for the patients and even those communities that many of you are serving and will serve. These questions, frankly, matter for how we do life together.
I was given the task of addressing this pair of questions, first to share a little bit about my faith journey or lack thereof, and then whether or not I think the human brain is just a fallible machine. I'm going to start with my faith journey, which as a child for me would mean that I wanted to have nothing to do with faith. I thought science was the way to know truth. And I really didn't want to believe anything unless it could be proven scientifically. I grew up in a family that had a Christmas tree, a secular Christmas tree once a year, but never went to church even for Christmas or Easter. And I saw no signs of religion in my family. One day I was babysitting for a neighbor who I thought was really cool. In fact, he was also a dentist. And we didn't have any other doctors in the neighborhood. I thought he was a neat man. His wife was neat. Kids were great. I really liked this family. And they decided to invite me to church. And I thought, I don't like church. What are these nice people doing wanting to go to church? So I managed to have a stomach ache that Sunday when I had a hard time telling them no, but I was sick. The following Sunday, the same thing. Now, you guys are all doctors or studying to be doctors, right? How many Sundays in a row can a person have a stomach ache before they finally catch on to you, which he did eventually after multiple weeks of me not realizing how stupid my excuse was. And he said, what matters most is not that you come to church. What matters most is for you to know what you believe. And I thought, I never really thought much about what I believe other than that, I believe science. And he asked if I'd ever read the Bible. And I thought myself to be a pretty smart student, like I'm sure everybody here is, or you wouldn't be in med school. And I thought, I'm a pretty well-educated person, and this is the #1 best-selling book of all time. I probably should have read it. He suggested that I start with Proverbs. And that was a good suggestion for me because in my arrogance that all religious stuff, including the Bible, must be full of bunk, starting with Proverbs meant that I was starting with some incredible wisdom. And as I would read it, I realized that I actually had a lot to learn. I went on and decided I should read the whole Bible. You could do that in a year, 3 books from the Old Testament, 2 from the New. And so I did that. And as I was doing that, I had this sort of disturbing feeling that I was kind of starting to believe in God. Now, I won't go into that in much detail here, except that it bothered me. And so I decided I needed to do something about that too. Maybe I was becoming a product just of my culture, which was kind of in a Christian neighborhood. So I did a special course in my high school at this point, self-study, where I was allowed to study whatever I wanted, and I decided to study the major world religions. I decided to get to know people from these religions and visit their temples and their mosques and try to understand what it was that drew them to this, and sort of hoping that I would get tired of all of this and go back to just being interested in science. Well, that didn't happen. Gradually, through another lengthy process I won't go into here, I became a Christian. And that was not an easy decision for me, but it is one that I continue to try to practice today. And I'm mindful here, my husband's always saying, remember, doctors only practice medicine. You're not perfect at it. I am far from a perfect Christian. I don't know any people who are, and I try to practice it. So not an ideal, many times falling quite short of any ideal there. So my childhood through high school and college was this transitional process, but I still love science. I still think science is extremely important. I am a scientist. I focus on science, and we have a ton to learn from it, including about the brain. And when I first came to MIT as a grad student, I was kind of enamored of the field of AI and thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool if I could take my mathematical models and figure out how to get brains to be smarter? And the part of it that I worked on was computer vision, teaching computers to see what they were looking at. In the early days when video was first being digitized, we would feed the computer a whole TV episode and see if it could find Seinfeld, and when he came in the room. And could it find if a joke was funny, right? Could it see what you liked? We started asking a lot more questions as humans started to interact with the content. And we realized that as we tried to build machines that could perceive things like people did, that could perceive not just with their cameras like our eyes and with their microphones like our ears and with other sensors we were giving them, that we didn't really understand how to put it all together. One Christmas break, I was reading Richard Saitowicz's book, The Man Who Tasted Shapes, Synesthesia. And in that book, where a man was feeling shapes on his hand while he tasted soup, Richard began a journey where he found that some of the key coming together of the perceptual senses was happening deep in the brain, not in the cortex, easily picked up by EEG, but in these deeper structures that were the home of memory, emotion, and attention. And I thought, memory's important, attention's important. And you can guess, as a woman in science, I did not want to touch emotion. But you heard in the bio. Fast forward, I realized emotion was extremely important, and we needed to start dealing with it. And I had to start dealing with it. So I decided I was getting close to being up for tenure. And how do you sabotage your career in 2 easy steps? Start doing stuff with emotion. But in the Media Lab, where they let you take risks, I was able to put together sort of a solid mathematical modeling case, and then this crazy book that I called Affective Computing, which tried to get other people interested in working on this. And I talk in this book about the need not only to give computers skills of emotional intelligence, but in some cases to maybe give them mechanisms that are like emotion. Now, this raises a lot of issues about what separates us from machine. Now, most of our work doesn't focus on making machines that are like people. Most of it focuses on things like helping people be better at communicating emotion. So this slide is to remind me to tell you what my boss always wanted me to work on that I didn't do for a long time. He kept saying to me, Roz, when are you going to build me the mood ring that tells me my wife's mood before I go home? Now, reading mood is hard. We read facial expressions. We listen to voice. We read physiology off the body. And these days, we're doing that. And I'm thrilled to be here with distinguished neurologists also, because I'm working with a lot of neurologists. We're now mapping central mechanisms in the brain to physiological peripheral mechanisms. And we're able to do things like sense certain phenomenon co-occurring with seizures that can allow us to give more sophisticated alerts than just a mood ring type alert. We are also working on measuring the activity and physiology and changes that might precede, while somebody still looks like they're healthy, might precede them falling into depression, with the goal of forecasting and preventing diseases such as major depressive disorder. Very exciting area to work in. But today, I think, where we want to go a little bit more is, what does it mean when the computer actually has emotional ability? And let me see if I can play this movie here. See if it will let me do that. I'm not seeing my mouse. There we go. Here.
So another important skill for the robot to be able to learn from people is being able to recognize communicative intent.
It's not playing. Uh-oh.
And the way we've done that most human right now is to have the robot recognize by tone of voice. Are you praising it? Are you scolding it?
I guess it's not connection to it.
No.
Okay, let's try again.
Well-timed no. Thank you. It was playing here.
I guess it's not playing.
It's not playing. Go back to just the non-show mode where it was playing, and we'll just show it there, and you'll just see it small.
Oh, just a small. Okay.
Yeah.
Are you sure? Okay.
Oh, sure. It's important for you to see how the robot responds here. This robot is one done by Cynthia Brazil. I was on her doctoral thesis committee. This is old, but it was pioneering because it was the first robot to really not just sense affective information, but to respond to it. And this is responding to the tone of voice.
So another important skill for the robot to be able to learn from people is being able to recognize communicative intent. Very good, isn't it? And the way we've done that most human right now is is to have a recognized by tone of voice. Are you praising it? Are you scolding it?
Where did you put your body?
No. No. You're not to do that. No.
All right, so Kismet looks like Kismet feels bad when you fuss at it, but Kismet is not actually feeling bad, right? It's just looking like it. Now, this is important. We can give computers the appearance of emotion. We can also give them, and I won't go through the details here. I made it small just so you won't read the details. You can see our papers online if you want. We can also give them internal mechanisms that are little programs they run that simulate emotion and that make it act as if it's frustrated, or make it act as if it's happy, or make it act as if it's sad. But it doesn't feel frustrated or happy or sad. In fact, it doesn't feel anything, and it doesn't have conscious experience. And we don't know how to give computers anything that is truly like that in us today. Now, it doesn't mean that someday we might not be able to. We don't know. And the story I want to leave you with here is when aliens a long time ago, there's a story of aliens finding instructions to build a transistor radio. And they got all the parts, they followed the instructions, they put it together, they weighed it, they looked at it looked like it was supposed to, it weighed as much as it was supposed to, it had a knob, they turned the knob, and when the knob turned, music played. And they said, hurrah! Now we understand how a radio works, and now we know where music comes from. As if they could fully understand this simply by building something that functioned like this particular set of functions. Often in computer science, we're challenged, gee, if you just build it and it acts like it, that's good enough. But is it good enough? My Cynthia, when she built Kismet, Ehsan here, when he built this mock avatar that interacts with people to help train people who could use some improvement in social skills, many of us. When they build these creatures, they have a choice as living outside of the world of the creature, whether or not the creature will acknowledge them as their maker, whether or not the creature even knows what a human is, whether or not the creature has some autonomy or freedom to say whatever it wants. And I think you could see some fascinating parallels there to us. And finally, to leave you with a question for further thinking, do you live as if you are a machine? Some people, like my friend Rod Brooks here, says, we are machines. In fact, he says, I am a robot. And he's a roboticist, and he builds robots. And the girl on the left is a robot. This is one of Hiroshi Ishiguro's robots modeled after his daughter. This is Rod Brooks, real human being. But I want you guys especially to think about this, because as doctors or training to be doctors, if you treat people like they are merely a machine or merely a bag of parts, even sophisticated, interesting parts, how does that feel when that turns around on you? Do you live your life that way? And Rod, to his credit, even though he has fun saying he's a robot, he recognizes he does not live his life in a way that is consistent with that. So how do you live your life? And do you want to live your life consistent with the thought that you are just a fallible machine? Thank you.
I feel a little odd is because usually we physicians, when we talk, we have slides, and I don't have slides. Just to introduce myself, I'm delighted to see some familiar faces that I've seen in class, but those of you who don't know, I'm a neurologist, and the way we neurologists approach things, taking the example Dr. Picard just gave you, is the story of some guy in Kalahari Desert suddenly finds a radio and didn't know what it looked like, and picks it up and turns the knob and starts speaking. And he gets excited, opens it up, and pulls out some wires, and it stops speaking. So we neurologists are the ones who pull up the wire and and the radio stops speaking, because we look at lesions of the brain. That's the way we study the brain. And I'm always in awe of people who understand mathematics, because most of us went to medical school because we were bad at math. But particularly, there are two things in mathematics that just blew my mind and still does. One was the concept of zero. Just couldn't understand nothingness. And the other one was the concept of infinity, even worse, because I just could not understand how things can go to infinity. And because I couldn't understand those two, I got stuck in neurology. And I got stuck with the brain. So for those of you who are expecting metaphysical, supernatural discussions from me, I am way down below, stuck in the brain. And the other thing about the brain is that we didn't know it existed until way into human culture, because our forefathers, the original anatomists, were all grave robbers. That's the way they did anatomy. And for that reason, most medical schools actually were built next to graveyards, because they used to send the medical students to go and steal bodies and bring them in. And still they are. Some of the major medical schools, including our own, was built next to a graveyard. The reason why they didn't see the brain is because almost 6 hours after death, the brain itself turns into mush, and therefore they'd never seen it. Until in 1500, a man named Vesalius, who all of you must have heard, and we owe him a lot, was dissecting the head, and the brain fell into a bucket of wine. Now, what was wine doing there? Of course, if you're grave robbing, you've got to have something to soothe your nerves. But what happened was that the brain became fixed. It was possible for him to cut it, and for the first time, to see this incredible structure inside. Now, that was 1500. And you can imagine that for a long time, they couldn't just quite go around and look at live people and open up their head and throw it in wine and find out what's going on with their brain. Until about middle of 19th century, a very knowledgeable neurologist in Vienna by the name of Gall started trying to figure out what goes on with the brain. And he had seen the lumps and bumps, that those of you who have seen the brain, the lumps and bumps. I'm sorry, I don't have a slide to show you, but nonetheless, he figured out that the lumps and bumps on our head represents the lumps and bumps on the brain. So he went around feeling people's head and found a lump somewhere and said, this is your area for sublimity. I notice some people are touching their sublimity area right now. And you can imagine people got very excited about this. And among the people who got very excited about it was a man named Spurzheim, who was his student. And it's important for all of you to know, those of you who are HMS may already have met him, because his skull is up on the 4th floor of Cantway Library, which if you haven't been up to the museum, you should go and see the skull. You can't miss the skull, it's a big skull. Anyhow, Spurzheim, student of Gall, he decided that to give qualities to these lumps and bumps. And there in Vienna, almost every corner, they opened up a shop. They used to call it cranioscopy. You could go in there, they would feel your lumps and bumps. You say, you have a big lump for pre-med, you would go into medicine or something like that. And like Starbucks, there was one in every corner. But it didn't take that long for the whole concept to become discredited. Now, like every concept that gets discredited in Europe, it got on a boat and came to Boston. It did. Spurzheim came here. That's why his skull is here. And overnight, this guy gave a few lectures downtown Boston and turned American neuroscience to phrenology, which is what the science was called. So they all became phrenologists. And he got typhus here within a couple of months and died. And the story of his death and why the skull is here is another story. But nonetheless, the concept of feeling for brain for those qualities, like sublimity, etc., started with these guys. It wasn't until about 1861 where someone who was familiar with phrenology, named Pierre-Paul Broca, found a patient who was unable to produce language. And then, lucky for him and lucky for the patient died very quickly after he had seen him. He got the brain and found that this guy had a stroke in the area we now call Broca's area. And that was the first correlation between brain function of a function extremely important to what we call mind, which is language, and an area of the brain. And that started off essentially what we as neurologists do. Yeah, we looked at lesions, tried to figure out what was missing, and then decided, oh, maybe this is the part that does that. Now, the problem with that kind of thing is, obviously, you can imagine, it's not clean science. And not only that, but this meant destruction of the brain to assume what the function of the brain would be, and also the eternal question, which Descartes had put on the map, but had been before him too, was, is mind the same thing as this mushy substance, or is it something different? And are functions of mind, particularly those functions that are so dear to us, such as our thoughts, such as our beliefs, are they just related to this mass, or is it something beyond that? Now, when you asked me about how I got here, Dr. Smith asked me how you got here, I was going to tell him I came down Longwood Avenue, and then I found out that the medical school was all wrapped up in some paper or whatever it is, and I turned around and went to Vanderbilt. But that shows you that how much we are in present. Then I thought about, he asked me, I have to admit, I had not thought about how to think about this, but my own journey here was very different from yours in this way, that I was born in Iran, in Persia, of a Jewish mother and a Baha'i father. Now, it always reminds me of this Woody Allen joke. He used to say, I'm an agnostic, my wife is an atheist, and we have not decided what religion not to bring the kids up in. So when you have two parents of different religions, two things can happen. And one of them is you get very confused, for one thing. The other one is nobody pushes you toward one or different system of ethics. And then, to add to the confusion, they sent me to Catholic school. And I was there for about 12 years. Now, this was a Catholic school in Iran, which by law had to teach us about Islam. So here I was, learning about Islam in a Catholic school, while my Catholic friends were going to the church, which had beautiful music and had those beautiful stained glass windows, which I was dying to go and see. And more importantly, these guys were going to confession, which to somebody who has never been to confession is extremely mysterious and wonderful. And the only time I sneaked into the confession booth, the father, the priest, immediately recognized me from, get out of here. So I never got to confess, never got to confess. Now, from there, my journey took me to the American University in Beirut. Now, that place was a smorgasbord. It was just, you could find anything there. It was on the crossroads. There were Christians, and there were Muslims, and even Jews at that time, which was unusual for them. But there were animists there. There were people from Africa. A very close friend of mine was an animist. So here I was suddenly exposed to all these fantastic religions. And the location where, to the right of me, was Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, the Abrahamic linear religions. And to the left of me, which was the East, was Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, which are all cyclical religions. And you could talk about confusion. Suddenly now, I didn't know whether rebirth was right, or was I heading directly toward Tartarus. So that happened, and here I am, completely confused, no guideline, and stressful. I can tell you as a neurologist now, I know exactly what was going on with me. I would have given myself a prescription for Valium at that time. Nonetheless, ended up at Hopkins in Baltimore in medical school. In medical school, and this is when I had an epiphany. One day, I was in the emergency room, and there was this surgical resident who was clever as they come, informed as they came, and I thought he was a god in knowledge and what he did. He had taken me to the operating room. I saw him operate, just a magician. So we went down to the emergency room. Down the emergency room, they brought in a stretcher with an African-American woman on the stretcher who was in coma because she had diabetes, she had become hypoglycemic and lost consciousness. They brought her in. And the two of us stood there looking at her. I was on this side of the stretcher, he was on the other side. And as we were talking, he was explaining to me what hypoglycemia does to mind, essentially. She woke up. She woke up and reached for his hand. And he pulled back. And I didn't have time to even think about this. Reflexly, I put my hand in there. And she grabbed my hand. And she lipped, "Thank you." That moment, I realized that I found my religion. And very soon I found that the founder of our profession, Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago, had come up with a statement very interesting. He said, "We cure little, we heal often, but we comfort always, always." Now, there I found that I belonged to a cult. It was the cult of Hippocrates. It turned out that he himself belonged to a cult. He was a Pythagorean. Guess what? Mathematicians. They knew zero and infinity. I had no idea. So here I was, suddenly I found what the purpose was. What the purpose was. That religion without science would be superstition. But science without religion would be lack of purpose. Now we have to define our terms. What do we mean by religion? So then I started my research, etc., and my interest was in visual arts, in paintings. And I was looking at artists. And among them, was looking for artists that produced a lot of work, which we called hypergraphia. But my professor, who was teaching me about this, also said that these people suffered from epilepsy, some of them, and that also in addition to hypergraphia, which means producing a lot of artwork or writing a lot, etc., and there are a lot of examples of that, they also become hyper-religious, he said. Now, not wanting to study religion, I was studying the other ones, but I noticed that. And the question came up, is religiosity the same thing as faith? If, say, by accident of birth, say Dr. Picard was born in Bombay, would he be a devout Hindu when he was here and she became a devout Christian? So if we just studied the brain for the idea of holding beliefs, are we studying something different from faith? So I want to tell you all of that so that you know where I'm coming from. I'm just stuck in the brain. And then also, although I've tried to study religion, it has been not quite religion. I've been studying religiosity, meaning holding on to beliefs. And I've not been studying it in the normal brain. I've been studying in a brain that has some problems with it. But one thing I can tell you as a physician is that part that made the epiphany for me, the issue of comfort. That in my experience, this institution that started with polytheism and all the way to today gives comfort to people that as a physician I have to respect and to use. Now, using means striving toward that goal. And all of you who are in healthcare, I hope you realize what our purpose is to give comfort. And whatever tool you have in your hand to do that, you must respect, worship, and use. Thank you.
Well, wonderful. Thanks to Dr. Picard and Dr. Khoshbin for those very engaging opening presentations. And now we want to begin a moderated discussion just to flesh some of these ideas out just a little bit here. We know we are wrestling with this idea, is the human brain just a fallible machine? Both of you have raised these kinds of what some would consider existential questions that come up, questions about purpose, so on and so forth. which brings us to this idea of what kind of universe do we find ourselves in. So how should we think about our relationship to the universe as human beings more broadly? Maybe you can have a few minutes to flesh this out. So there's a quote from Stanford neuroscientist Bill Newsom, and Bill Newsom is a Christian, and he says, what kind of universe ultimately do we live in? Do we live in a universe where our highest values and intuitions about ethical behavior are in touch with the central reality of the universe and the reason that universe was built from the beginning? Or are our highest values and ethical intuitions kind of a joke, an accident that really have nothing to do with what the universe is about in the long run, and in fact, the universe is about nothing in the long run? So do you think this stark choice that Professor Newsom offers is accurate, or is there another way of thinking about our sense of purpose in the universe that is something kind of external to the brain? And this is to both of you. So perhaps we'll start with Dr. Picard.
Yeah, this reminds me again of what my colleague Rod Brooks had said. If you believe that everything is just if you only believe in the material stuff, and maybe you also subscribe to kind of a whole chain of events that were random and undirected, and there was no other shaping of that, and no meaning, no purpose out, present in any of that, then it's very hard to get meaning and purpose in our daily existence, and to get meaning and purpose from comforting somebody, or meaning and purpose from building technology to try to help people. What's the point, right? So yeah, I actually think we need to recognize that we all seek that. I mean, our very conversation here would have no meaning or purpose, right, if those things didn't exist. We'd be wasting our time.
If I were to talk to him, I would have to ask for some definition of terms. Forever, people have defined two concepts, if you wish, for, if you want to call it universe, you want to call it God, is that is there a creator of the universe, or is there a personal God, my God, and the one that I talk to and that cares for me? And the concept of the personal God and the creator God has to be separated. And you walk the mystic walk, but you have to do it with practical feet. And since we understand about the Big Bang and the time and space thing, the idea of the universal God has sort of been separated, whichever way you define it. The issue of the personal God clearly has to do with him watching what I do. And of the 5 branches of philosophy, metaphysics, we have all agreed that now sort of is out of the range of science. But ethics is the one that is most importantly deals with daily activity of the scientist and whoever does anything, but particularly, I hope, for all of the healthcare folks here, particularly for our medical students and physicians, is particularly ethics becomes very important. And of course, that is where we look toward ethical systems to guide us in our actions. Now, is that so peculiar that we have to particularly choose one rather than the other? Is the idea of good universal? It is universal. I was listening to Dr. Picard and the emotion business with the robot. It is fascinating that if you look among all nations and all parts of nations all over the world, expressions of emotion in our face is the same. It's the same, no matter where you go. So the first thing I learned, I always thought that the same way that our dogs sort of look like us because they learn from us how to respond. I swear to you, we have a little dog, my daughter has Delilah. She smiled just like me. And now I decided that she must have learned it from me. But then if all dogs smile like Delilah, then that's something about smiling of dogs. So we all smile the same way. We hurt the same way. We frown the same way, no matter where in the universe we are. I mean, our universe, of course. There might be some other place too. So the issue of ethics becomes so important, separate from systems. Ethics is universal. That's what Kant said. So if you are trying to set up an ethical system, it should be such that it could become universal. That is the imperative. So here we are, and whichever way we define it, and whichever path we choose, we are choosing the path of ethics. We are choosing the path toward good. We are choosing the path toward good. And good to us is service for those of us who deal with other people. And whichever part of the world you are and whatever you do, it's again service. And that to me is the ultimate. Now, is that the same thing as creation of the universe? Of course, I have difficulty with that in terms of the Big Bang. But is that to me my personal God? Of course it is. How could it be otherwise?
Thank you. This question here in terms of service, as you mentioned, as you were working in healthcare and finding your religion through compassion and comforting those who are suffering. Dr. Picard, I know you've done a lot of work working with people who are developing technologies for those who may be hurting and suffering in different ways. And so I guess the question is, if we are pursuing these paths of goodness, right, and looking towards what this looks like, and understanding the importance of service, what is it that makes human beings valuable, right? What is it that, is there something about human beings as such that makes them valuable, that is distinct from maybe other animals, right? Is there a uniqueness to humanity? What are your thoughts here? Dr. Khoshbin, in some of our correspondence, I was tickled when you, and I really appreciate when you said, it's like, well, I can say nothing else other than I believe in the brain, right? And I really wanted to hear you kind of flesh that out a little bit as well. But if you guys were asked the question, what is it that makes humans valuable, right? Such that we should be working towards these ends of comfort and serving others. So maybe Dr. Picard, if you.
I was going to let him go first this time.
I have to admit, I'm just in love with the brain. What can I say? I became a neurologist because it is sort of, again, interesting how we, again, thought about the brain. When they first saw it, they looked at it, with all those lumps and bumps. They called it intestinoid because they had opened up the belly, they had seen the intestines. It looked just like that. And they had opened up the intestines, by the way, and they knew what was in it. So they were not so anxious to open up the brain to see what's in that. Although we know some brains contain the same material. And those of you who have been watching the debates may have come to the same conclusion. But nonetheless, they eventually figured out by 1901 when they managed to stain the neurons that this thing is not just the lumps and bumps, it's just an incredible meshwork. This is way before they knew anything about networking or anything like that. That this incredible network of, now we know something like about 100 billion neurons, connecting to each other, each one to 10,000 other ones. You can, in terms of, I apologize if my computerese is not good. If it's FLOP, is that the one that they're building now, flops? The one that they're building here, 300 flops, which means just quadrillion connections. Still, if you consider the 100 billion neurons times 10,000 connections each, which means a lot more synapses that are not just the connection between one neuron and the other, but also they are pre-inhibiting and exciting, which means even one synapse can act in 3 different ways. You have to imagine that AI is 3.8 billion years behind the evolution of our brain. 3.8. AI the term was only used in 1955, and even Turing was not that long before that, and his first article was, what, 1936? It makes it only 80 years that we are dealing with us creating something that is supposed to think. But to think about this 3-pound thing that each one of you have brought with you right now in your brain, you know what it does? And how its software is not just software. It is a software that instantaneously, as you're speaking with, or as I'm talking to you or you're listening to me, instantaneously your software changes. Instantaneously, your softwares are flexible and change. More importantly, they are capable of creation. They are capable of creativity. It's amazing. I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night saying, wow, what an opportunity that tomorrow morning I can go in there and meet a brain that changes almost every second. What can I say?
Yeah, I love hearing, I love how amazingly our brains are made too. I share your passion. In the back of my mind now, I'm also thinking of something else, and that is that when we think about human value, there's a tendency sometimes to think of it in terms of our parts. You know, like your brain works well, somebody else may be missing half of their brain. Does that make them less valuable? Or my mom with Alzheimer's, does that make her less valuable if dementia is setting in, if her memory doesn't work as well? Or I've worked a lot with people with autism, some of whom couldn't speak. And so does not having language make them somehow less human or less valued? Or I work with Hugh Herr at the Media Lab, who's double amputee, you know, and people who are missing their limbs are coming in all the time. Does that make them somehow less human or less valued? And I think if we are gonna think some of these hard questions, and one of my friends with autism used to title her first blog, Ballast Existence. That was the term the Nazis used for, you know, throwing overboard the stuff that wasn't valued. So since people like her would not have been valued in that regime, and people like us who are getting older, or, you know, or less able to do work, or who are lacking some of these amazing human abilities that I share your awe for, if we define what makes us valued in terms of these things, then I think we get in trouble and we go down that path that, you know, Hitler's scientists justified many people going down. So I think it's important, this is where I love what the Hebrew Christian scriptures say, you know, that we are known by God outside, and that gives us value. And that way, even if I can't speak, even if I lose my limbs, even if I have dementia, I am still a child of God. And because of that view, which has really changed my thinking, I feel that it's, you know, vital to treat all people equally, all human beings equally, even those who can't talk to me, even those who have expressed, who might like later learn to type and talk to me and tell me that there was a time in their life when they sat in the corner and drooled and people were writing them off completely. But later they developed abilities just very late in life and have become brilliant communicators, just not verbally. So I find, again, in this worldview, hope and joy in answering that question outside of any stuff that comprises us.
100% agree with you. I wasn't talking about brain necessarily giving us different values, but we are not recreating the wheel. I mean, you know, this discussion has been going on since the time of Aristotle, when he started ranking, and he put people among animals and animals lower than vegetation. Yeah, that's what Aristotle did. You know, it was his classification was that, you know, people are on top, then animals, then you can eat animals, you know, because you're below, and animals can eat vegetables. That's what his classification was. Of course, we have passed 2,300 years beyond that. But what makes humanity interesting is the ability of your brain feeling that compassion for the one that could not do it, and to help and care for the one who didn't do it. I always teach my students that what makes the human species particular is because we never leave our injured behind. All other species, if somebody gets injured, they're gone. We don't. So does that give value to us? No matter where our brain is, no matter what our brain does, no matter what our brain can't do or can do, of course. And that's what makes humanity special. Now, again, you think about, is this external to us or is it internal to us?
Right.
I can see how it can be internal to us. I can see how our brain can be compassionate and how this incredible complex of networks and neurons can emerge a mind that can be compassionate. But at the same time, it can emerge a mind that would be a Hitler, or we see every day on TV wearing black things and orange things and doing, beheading and all of that. And that brain probably under MRI would look the same as any one of your brains. But thank God you guys are not like that. Why? Because compassion can come from within. It can be taught. And if there is a system of ethics out there that teaches that to us, frankly, I don't care how it's explaining it. I think still that what makes humans special is that your brain can feel compassion for those that are less probably able to run or to necessarily come up. It's amazing also what brains do in Alzheimer's. For instance, I'm interested in visual arts. That's what I started with and still do. Patients with Alzheimer's suddenly create these incredible works of art that the creation is beyond belief. I have a patient that, I swear to God, when I look at her paintings, I wish I could do one of them. And not able to do certain things that we all take for granted, like remember necessarily what the date is. So it doesn't necessarily have to do the 3 R's, I think. I think that what it needs is that some of them, those brains, should feel compassion. That, to me, is the most highest value in humanity, and that's what makes us human. And I hope we are not stratifying like Aristotle, or even more recently, C.S. Lewis, talking about whether animals have soul. That still, to me, is a question. Every time I look at the little Delilah, I think Delilah's got soul, What can I say? And I can't believe my friend, the animist, who I always remember this joke about people who are pantheists, that if a pantheist goes into a pizza parlor and orders a pizza, what would he say? He said, make me one with everything. So if you're one with everything, you're one with your animals, you're one with the vegetation, you're one with the world. But you are the human brain, and the human brain feels compassion. And that's what makes it special.
Did you want to interact with that anymore?
We can keep going. Yeah, I know we want to get to the audience questions too.
Yes, absolutely. We've got a few more minutes that we can engage here. Dr. Picard, as you were sharing just a little bit about this, your experience of saying along the lines of that, the robots don't have consciousness, emotions, and so on and so forth. So we see these robots able to kind of respond, right? You can train them a particular kind of way, but you are fairly adamant that, look, these robots aren't human. And so you think about the complexity of the robots, artificial intelligence, and how all of this comes together. Think about the complexity of the brain and so on and so forth. So I really would like to get at, and I guess I should say, this is not so much for Dr. Picard, but maybe for both of you, this whole idea of moral responsibility. Right? So many people are concerned when you think about the brain, and if people reduce what it means to be a human person, let's say, to brain states. So Dr. Khoshbin was talking about this notion of mind, right? Is mind, or can it be accurately reduced to brain states and so on and so forth? And people are concerned that if you have a reductionist view of human persons, that all of our psychology, if this is the case, can be reduced to brain, then question about freedom of the will, moral responsibility, and those kinds of things become in tension in some ways with these ways of thinking. Just your reflections on this whole idea of moral responsibility, especially as you because you talk a lot about compassion, ethical systems, these things can be learned. And I find it interesting as you talk about the brain, you take some of the things that people are doing that may be dehumanizing in some ways, but yet you'll say the brain looks the same, right? So how does all this fit together, right?
So, yeah, I studied free will, if you wish, in a very interesting way. As I was explaining, I'm in my research, I'm a physiologist. So I look at the electrical activity of brain. I'm looking at responses of the brain within milliseconds. That's what we look for. And one of the ways you look at the brain is what's called evoked potentials. In other words, what you do, say, for instance, you flash a light into somebody's eye and you look at the response of the brain to that light, which shows up at about 100 milliseconds in our occipital cortex. 100 milliseconds is a brief period of time. So one of the first things we started looking at is that if you ask somebody to sit there and just flex their finger, and you hook up an electrode to that to flex the finger, and then you put an electrode over the area of the brain just slightly next to the motor cortex, you will see that before they flex their finger, by 600 milliseconds, a long time, that there's a potential in the brain. It's called the brain shaft potential. I've measured it 1,000,000 times, okay? So what that tells you is that before you move the finger, your brain already, 600 milliseconds before you move your finger, has started it. And you are not aware of it until it does. In other words, we have tested that again. You're not aware of the motion until you do it, but 600 milliseconds before that, it started. So if your brain is doing something you're not aware of, if during that 600 milliseconds you stab somebody, are you responsible? That was a big question about free will. Everybody suddenly said there's no free will, the brain does its own stuff, this little thing is that, frightened, I was looking at it and I see it. It was amazing. But what we call free will, what we call our choices, the reason why you don't stab somebody, even if your brain has started, is because, again, in your brain, there are areas that will stop you even if the thought came through your mind, even if the potential, the bright shift started. That's where morality comes in, is when do you stop yourself from doing something rather than doing it? So free will is there. And those people who say there's no free will because of the bright shaft potential are wrong, because free will is not the initiation. Free will is the inhibition. So is morality inhibition? Is it? Or excitation? If it is not excitation, then our brain is necessarily evil to start with, and now we got to train it to be good. That's what original sin is. Are we evil? I don't think so. I think our brains are not evil. I think our brains can react a lot, but that part, the inhibition, is what we learn from our parents, we learn from our society, we learn from our religious leaders, from our faith. We learn how to control our behavior. And that's what free will is all about. And we make choices. We make choices about ethical systems constantly. We could call it anything you want. Mm-hmm. Well, we gotta call it an ethical system.
Dr. Picard.
I think my brain is fallible. I forgot the question.
Yeah, just this whole idea of moral responsibility. Maybe that's where we're, and just with this idea of free will, many people are concerned about a reductionist account of human persons. And is there free will or moral responsibility, and how does that work?
Big, complicated questions. Just after you get your doctorate, the questions don't get easier. Let me maybe just address one little piece of it. I love what you're saying. I love those free will findings. The conscious awareness following the moment of decision is so interesting. One more thing with the moral, you described it as holding back and inhibition, and I think that's very important. Sometimes also, I think we need like a moral imperative to take action also. It's not just a holding back from doing something we shouldn't do, but sometimes we need to kind of have some imperative to get us off of our comfort, out of our comfort zone and do something. I'm reminded of the priest who said, when you said comforting the afflicted, I once heard a sermon from a priest who said, our job, I think this was his as a priest, is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. and you know, if you're like sitting there, like just sort of taking care of yourself and life is good, and there's somebody suffering nearby, and you're not like willing to exit your comfort zone and maybe inconvenience yourself and go out of your way and give up some of your comforts so that somebody else can, so you can equalize that a bit, then maybe we need a little bit of moral kick in the seat of the pants sometimes to go do that. And so I've found that that's an important counter to what you're saying as well, although I agree also with the part that you described.
By the way, your brain is not fallible.
Oh, yes, it is.
As a neurologist,
Ask my husband.
You passed.
Note, he just skipped right over me, right, when he said that. That's okay. I get it, right? I get it. My wife reminds me of that often, so I get it.
Yeah.
Yours is not either.
Right, fair enough. Philosophers, right, often talk about, or ethicists often talk about this, what's called the is-ought problem, right? And basically what the is-ought problem is something like this. Like, can we get moral prescriptions from simply describing what is the case? Now, philosophers have given various responses to it to say, yes, you can go from what ought to be to what ought to be the case from what is the case. With respect to aspects of neurobiology and some of the conversations that we're having now, we're engaging in a lot of description, right? Description with regard to how the brain works, how we understand these philosophical questions about, the will and the choices and inhibition and so on and so forth. And so the question that some philosophers often want to ask is, from where does this ought come from, right? So that we ought to serve others. Yes, we can observe that our brains do perhaps express compassion and we move to compassion, but why ought we to do that? Especially if we think we could flourish maybe our own communities or maybe on our own by not treating people compassionately. So how does this purely descriptive account of human beings get us to these ethical imperatives that Dr. Picard just raised in this last interchange here, reflections here?
Yeah, I mean, you're in a helping profession, so, you're naturally out there doing all these awesome things for people. I come from a profession where I could just kind of sit in my own little world and read papers and write papers and probably never deal with a human being. In fact, I had a student once who said that he really didn't like people. He only liked computers. And when I had all my students to my house, and he came to my house, and he said, I want you to know this is my one social event of the year. And I like, okay, well, I hope you're having a good time, My kids were jumping all over him, But anyhow, he's a good friend now. And some of us are, like people here in this room, the fact that you're choosing medicine, you're probably, very outwardly focused toward helping others. But there are a lot of people in the world who, like me, are like strong introverts who would probably be perfectly happy to live in our little world and just take care of ourselves. And it took an imperative in my faith, in reading this, to get me to stop being that way, to get me, the girl who flunked show and tell, because I couldn't stand being up in front of people, to be at a place like this tonight. And it's, so for some of us, we need something outside of ourselves to tell us to get out of our comfort zone and go treat other people, not only as equals, but honor and respect them and think of them more highly than ourselves. Otherwise, we'd just focus on ourselves. So as one of those, and probably very much in the minority in this room, I find, this has made a huge difference in my life. At first, it made me extremely uncomfortable. And now the relationships, the way it's opened up my world, I would never go back. Am I comfortable? I'm still nervous, it's still hard. My skin conductance goes through the roof in social settings. But it's opened my world. It's such a better world.
What a blessing. But let me just, from the standpoint of the brain, try to answer that. First of all, we neuroscientists consider ourselves like philosophers. The difference is philosophers look at their own brain, we look at other people's brain. So now, just looking at other people's brains, the brain has been divided into two parts. This dualism has been going on all the time. You know, right side of the brain, left side of the brain is language, right side of the brain is attention, front of the brain is movement, back of the brain is sensation. This type of thing has been going on. But what I was taught by my teacher, Norman Geschwind, who was a professor here, he said there is also a upper part and a lower part of the brain, which we refer to as dorsal and ventral part of the brain. And the idea of compassion, et cetera, has to do with social interaction, which if you want to become Darwinian about it and go back to the herd, the upper part of the brain is responsible evolutionarily for preservation of self. And we know that the upper part, which goes from the back to the front, feels where you are, and then if you are threatened, it takes off, therefore preservation of self. It's the lower part of the brain, which is referred to as the temporal lobe, but that's a misnomer because it's not just temporal lobe, temporal frontal, et cetera, has to do with preservation of species. Preservation of species meaning that the individual in the herd also is responsible for other individuals, even the herd that leaves its injured behind, if it sees a threat, makes signals to the rest of the herd to get off. That responsibility is to the herd. And when we look at damage to these parts, we see that. You know, we've seen patients with stroke where they're paralyzed, they can't get away, et cetera. When the damage is to the part that has to do with social interactions, then we see a breakdown of the stuff we were talking about sometimes, the breakdown of say, preservation life, the breakdown of compassion to other people, aggression, et cetera, show up if there is problem with this ventral aspect of our brain. Now, how does that translate into ethics is that both of them, both the upper part and the lower part, are excited. And we now know about the neurotransmitters, we know about the pathways, et cetera. But the functions is not that also compartmentalized, you know, and that's why I used to say phrenology hasn't disappeared. Now we call it ephemerology, you know. Phrenologists were looking at the lumps and bumps. These guys are looking at the blood going someplace in the brain. It's really a lot more complex. It is a dynamic, parallel processing, multiple pathways with multiple flexible software that instantaneously changes. That's why when Snowy was asking me, do you think that artificial intelligence would surpass our brain? I said, not for a million years to come. Why? Because it still is not that flexible in terms of its software. It still doesn't have that creative software that you and I have got right now. So yes, we do need a system, but it can come from a system that's designed to help others. And that system can sometimes work better in certain circumstances than the other, but it is there for all of us. We all are members of the herd. We are members of the society. That's why we care for each other. And that's why we have to learn to have compassion. That's what we have to learn and choose a path that, as you have chosen, a path that would make you care, make you love. You know, we keep forgetting about the Greeks. You know, as a Persian, I have a hard time keep saying the Greeks thought about all of it, but they did. They did. They thought about the four things. It was chaos, earth, and Tartarus, you know, all those horrible things. But love, eros, was the big thing. And love comes from that part of the brain. And that's the purpose, is loving.
Let's take one last question here before we open it up to the larger group here for some interaction. And would I be safe here, Shah, just saying that you would be maybe have a more materialist understanding of the universe, that there are probably no kind of non-material entities that exist in our world? Would that be kind of fair or no?
No.
No, okay, good.
Because materialism has got bad name, right? And is mind an emergent function of a brain that is material? It is. It is emergent, therefore almost instantaneously becomes part of the outside world as soon as it emerges from our brains. Then instantaneously it can affect our brain. And if my mind produces thoughts that has in it compassion or feeling for existence of a God, it's a thought. And therefore that is not incompatible with that. It's not materialism.
Yeah, okay.
And it is that I take issue with the first person in that video that in fact reduced. I don't think we are reducing anything to brain. We are elevating what is in our heads. Each one of us has a universe in there. It's a 3-pound universe. Each one of us has his own universe, and thank God it thinks the same way, and it cares the same way, and it loves the same way. So is that quote-unquote materialism? I take issue with that. No, it's not.
And I appreciate you saying that. And the reason why I was asking is just because as you guys have gone back and forth and really have a deep appreciation for the functioning of the brain and human persons and so on and so forth, what I just kind of want to ask as we transition here is that what would it take perhaps to change your mind, either of your minds, about your current beliefs, right? Dr. Picard, you've been forthright that you have your views on human persons are informed by kind of Christian faith tradition. Your views are going to be informed by your very detailed work in neurobiology and also your work as a physician. And so what would it take to change your beliefs from where they are right now, if anything? Does that question make sense? Is it okay? Is it
I
clear
can tell
enough?
you.
Okay.
If a voice tonight gives me their lottery numbers for next week,
Right.
you got
There
it.
it
I
is.
changed
All right.
right
There it is. There it
right
is.
this second. I promise you all.
Fair enough. Dr. Picard.
My father-in-law was a fortune teller, knew a lot of tricks like that, so I'd be suspicious. Be careful. Actually, the Christian worldview depends upon things like historical evidence for the resurrection and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things there that I think would have to be have other explanations that are better than the ones I've seen. Essentially, that would have to be disproven.
Thank you.
Mike, I would just add, but I would never, ever, and I would change her mind, ever, because I believe in that. I think her path is a path that I would choose too. And I think that's the path is more important to me, frankly, than what we are considering, either the impetus for it or the end of it. It's the path that is the ethics. And I would never change anybody's path toward good. Anybody's path toward good, to me, is sacred.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Let's open it up for questions here. Now, just very quickly before you get the microphone, just try to be as succinct as possible with your question, and so that we can maximize the time to hear from our presenters today. So let's start here.
Thank you both so much. I was really interested by the discussion about this idea of reduction and sort of reduction to the biological, and I think you both mentioned that you're resistant to the idea that a person can be boiled down into like a soup of just matter. But I'm really curious about moving in the other direction. And this crazy hypothetical, like if you had some AI system, maybe 1 million years in the future, if we keep working on this, that's so sophisticated that very, very closely approximates a human brain. Do you think that there could be some translation there where you would be tempted to respect the humanity of that like really sophisticated computer? What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, Marvin Minsky used to say, well, wait till the robots become the robot rights activists to worry about that. But I mean, we could, if we decided to build that, we could expedite that kind of thing, right? And this gets back to sort of bigger ethical questions of, like, you know, what should we build? What do we want to build? What kind of future do we want to build? Is there a compelling reason to build that particular future? Or would we rather build something else? Because that is not inevitable, what you just described. I know some people describe it as inevitable, but it's not inevitable. It's engineers sitting around, you know, tonight at MIT and CMU and Stanford and places like that, deciding if they're going to push it this way or push it that way.
There was once a lecture like this. Somebody got up and said, our sun is going to be destroyed. It becomes a red giant in 50 billion years. Somebody raised their hand and said, how many years did you say? Said 50 billion. Said, oh, I thought you said 50 million. Oh, I feel a lot better. With regard to when we are going to get close, looking at the trajectory of computers, the way they're going, to come up with that instantaneous, flexible software instantaneously among that many pathways that modifies itself is sort of like 50 million years from now. So yeah, is it possible? Everybody will tell you, oh yeah, eventually sometime would be possible. But I don't think your great-great-grandchildren are gonna see it. So take a breath and be comfortable. It's 50 million, not 50 billion.
Let me ask a question from the from one of the other rooms here. Dr. Picard, particularly to Dr. Picard here, what are your thoughts regarding how humans have historically and still today used religion for death and destruction? Why do we have such a need to believe in something greater?
Why have they used it for death and destruction? You know, we certainly see horrible things done in the name of religion, including atheism, in the name of atheism. We see humans just do horrible things. You know, the concept of sin, that, like Ian mentioned in that movie there, I found it interesting when I first heard it explained from a Christian worldview that sin was not so much evil, like in us, as you referred to the evil, but was missing the mark. It's like we're made for a higher bar. We're made for a higher mark. We're made for something greater. And when we fall short of that, like, you know, you're shooting the arrow and you're missing the mark, it falls short, it doesn't reach the intended goal, that's what sin is. And so that helped me see it not so much as, you know, just as the awful that's there, but the look at what we could be and what is it that causes us to deviate or miss the mark. And lots of things bring about that horrible behavior, right? You know, greed, you know, politics, property, power trips, you know, all kinds of things, right, cause people to miss the mark. I don't see, certainly not in Christianity, any imperative to go do those horrible things, right? There is in some other religions, but not in Christianity. In ours, this is more seen as, you know, taking another's life is seen as a shortcoming.
Thank you. Let's go, I'm sorry, let's maybe right over here. Yes.
Hello, thank you guys for this discussion. I think my question is mainly for Dr. Picard, but you guys can both answer. I guess I was curious about if we're gonna think of the brain or the mind, if there's something that's outside of that, how does that reconcile with what we know about brain traumas, injuries, and exercising parts of the brain and how that changes personality and mood and the way people deal with risk?
I think we need your help on this one.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I've spent a big portion of my research on studying personality. The first thing that happened was that I went to my advisor at that time, and my advisor said, couldn't you pick something that had less variables than personality? personality is the sum total of our beliefs and experiences and past memories and what our parents told us, etc. So when you get to study it, the only way I could get is when personality is disturbed, then you would say, well, what's wrong here? Because if you go to try to personality, every single one of us here has a different personality, even if we had an identical twin. When I was little, I once asked my uncle, who became a psychiatrist later. At the time, he was, I think, a medical student. I said, how do you think of other people? And at that time, I never forget, he took a matchbox, and he said, people are like this matchbox. And he put it up like this. He said, there are three sides to this matchbox, and one side of it is our genes, one side of it is our education, and the other side is our environment. Like environment would be what your parents do, what your society does. Education would what somebody comes in and teaches you, and your genes that you brought with you. So even if you have somebody who has identical genes as you do, okay, still the other two dimensions will make you different. So nobody is going to be the same personality as the other. Now, the issue comes down again to what is quote unquote normal personality versus what's abnormal personality. And we have found very quickly that the definition of abnormal in our societies changes. So something that 30 years ago they considered as abnormal, right now it's not only not abnormal, sometimes even valued. So as we go on, and as we see people who have exhibiting different types of personality, could we judge at that time whether that is damaged personality, abnormal personality, or a different personality? Now, among the things that our herd mentality should do is to respect that difference. To respect that difference, particularly when our brain has evolved into such a complex organ that not only controls our own body, but communicates with the other one and influences the behavior of the other one, is the definition of damaged brain should change, unless that whatever it is causing harm to the other members of our herd. The Texas experience many years ago, none of you were probably at that time here, was that a guy went up on the University of Texas tower, and from there he shot people randomly with nothing to do with him. And then when they discovered him, they brought him down, and they found out that he had a brain tumor. That his brain tumor had affected his part of the brain, which is called the amygdala, which can cause aggressive behavior, which is not necessarily directed at anybody, either in the form of war or revenge or whatever, just random aggression. And people have done that kind of experiment with rats. And 1950s, a man named Delgado actually planted an electrode into the amygdala of charging bulls in a bull ring, and then with a radio signal, as the bull was charging, stopped it. This was a perfect example of aggression and stopping aggression with part of the brain. Now, is it possible to just blame everything on the amygdala? Is it possible to say that somebody whose behavior is a little bit more, say, different from ours has got a brain problem? Would we call it a problem? Would we call it just a different brain, a different personality? Should we value them? Should we have compassion for them? For those of us who are in healthcare, you have to have compassion for everybody. For everybody. That's what you swore to. I took the oath. When I graduated medical school, I took the Hippocratic Oath. I have to admit, at the time, I didn't realize what I was doing. But I took the oath to comfort always, no matter who. That room that I enter, it's my responsibility to care for it.
Let me, just for the sake of time here, let's ask one more question here of Dr. Picard, and then we'll have one closing question, and we'll turn it back over to the MC for the evening here. Dr. Picard, a question from one of the other viewers. What's the purpose of life for mentally retarded people who don't even have the ability of knowing God?
Easy questions, huh? Or is it, you know, if any of you read Douglas Adams' Life, the Universe, and Everything, it was just 42, right? The answer. I wouldn't presume that they don't have the ability to know God, first of all. I have seen so many people who are disabled, who people presume something about them, and later we realize that was not true. A person who could only count to 10, they'd been doing ABA therapy with them forever, and by 5th grade, they could still only count to 10. They thought they were no good at math. And then, lo and behold, they discover the kid's been learning algebra by listening to his big sibling in the kitchen at night. You know, so let's not presume. That's just not fair, I think. And you know, there's our ability to choose and love God, but we barely even can conceive of God's ability to choose and love us. It's revealed to us, but I think it's still beyond what we can fully fathom. So while I'm super fascinated and love hearing the stuff going on in the brain, I think about it a lot. I think it's so interesting. I also recognize that if science is sort of bounded by space and time, and there's a world outside of it, and if you have trouble thinking about this, I might think of, say if you're a game maker and you're making a character in a game, you can plant ideas into that character in the game's brain, so to speak, into what they communicate to other characters around them. And they don't know where those ideas come from, right? In fact, they could have a little program saying they thought of those ideas. That's how they explain where they came from. We do think of things. Our brains do all these processes that are described, and it's fascinating and wonderful. But what we don't know is, do they also have other capabilities that science has yet to reveal to us? And I think it's myopic to say it only has these capabilities. I think it's super fascinating to learn with science what capabilities we can. But I think we also need to remember that it's possible, in fact, we see over and over that science is limited, and what we know to be sort of the scope of it now keeps expanding. So I keep coming back to the famous love chapter in the Bible, 1 Corinthians 13. It's read at a lot of weddings. But at the end of it, it also talks about, for now we see as through a glass dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then in this next realm, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. So I find hope in that. I think we are fully knowable and we're fully known, but science doesn't, in this realm, doesn't yet let us get to that.
Thank you. And just if we could do this in maybe just a minute and a half or so each, what challenge would you leave with students here tonight? So let's start here, and then we'll come to my left. Yeah.
Well, I wear different hats in my life. I would like to think of myself first and foremost as a physician, and that's what I was trying to say, but I do science, I do research. My wife and I teach a course in medical ethics, so we talk to our students about ethics, and we use a lot of different ways of approaching the issues of medical ethics, which covers the same thing as the general ethics goes. I don't think I need to challenge anyone here to anything, but you know, we have a lot of tradition of human philosophy that we take for granted, but when we go back and read it, and that's what I would recommend, is that on your bedside table, keep reading, because as Socrates said, virtue is knowledge. Knowledge is, and you are all here because you are seeking knowledge, and knowledge is virtue. And then it was his student who tells us about, you know, Plato is about all these ideals, and obviously we have to have ideals and those perfections that we strive toward. And then, of course, as students of human nature and of students of the world, we should also remember that we have to be good scientists and observe and collect data. and make our decisions based on what we perceive as, at that time, true collecting correct data, like apply the scientific method to form our ideas. My advice is read, is keep reading, and read the philosophers, and don't think that just because they spoke 2,500 years ago, they're old. They're not. They touched upon the same questions we are dealing with, whether it was Socrates or whether it was Descartes. Descartes talked about the same things we are talking about right now in 1500. So read and make up your own, identify your own path, follow your bliss, identify your own path. And it's so individual, it's one-on-one, and God willing, your path would be toward good. God willing, your path would be toward compassion and caring and loving.
Thank you.
Thanks. So inspiring. I think I would challenge those who might come from the kind of background I came from. If some of you here are atheists or agnostics or materialists or just stuck on science is all there is, I would challenge you to read not only those philosophers, but read Proverbs, read the Gospels. Ask yourself, what difference would it make in my life if I were not sort of myopically focused on just science, but I allowed there to be something much greater? And what if the revelation about the person of Jesus Christ is true? And what would that mean in my life? So I would just challenge you to make sure that you've also thought about that.
Thank you. Join me in thanking panelists this evening.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.